In a city where power wears a uniform and profiling passes as procedure, two cops saw a red Aston Martin and a black man behind the wheel. Too polished, too calm, an easy target, they thought. What they didn't know was that Darius Cole wasn't just a driver. He was Homeland Security, deep cover, and already investigating the racket they were part of. They thought they were pulling over a suspect. In reality, they'd just exposed themselves to the one man trained to dismantle systems like theirs, quietly, surgically, and without warning. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The city unfolded in slow motion beneath the fading sun, its streets wide with heat and shadow, its people moving with the deliberate pace of those who had worked too long for too little and were now just trying to make it home. Darius Cole moved through it all in near silence, his hands relaxed on the wheel of the red Aston Martin that slid down the boulevard like a ripple of polished flame. The windows were lowered just enough to let in the scent of summer and the distant hum of horns, while a ribbon of old jazz curled from the speakers, the melody slow and worn like a familiar memory. He had chosen this route for no particular reason. It wasn't the fastest or the most scenic, and it didn't pass by any place he needed to be. But after the kind of work he had just finished, months of coded files, encrypted channels, sleepless weeks buried inside systems that didn't exist on any map, there was something soothing in drifting through the real world again. The job was over. The check had cleared. And for the first time in what felt like years, there was no phone vibrating in his pocket with the weight of someone else's emergency. He wore a gray button-down, pressed but not stiff, sleeves rolled casually just below the elbow, and a watch that hinted at quiet success without demanding attention. The suit jacket was folded neatly on the passenger seat beside him, along with a sealed envelope he hadn't yet opened. The car, though, it said everything he didn't. It was new, paid in full, and, perhaps most importantly, his. It wasn't a rental, wasn't a favor, wasn't borrowed from someone with deeper pockets or better connections. It was the first truly selfish thing he'd done in a long time, and he was letting himself enjoy it. The neighborhood changed gradually as he drove, the glass and stone of downtown giving way to squat brick buildings and long fences topped with barbed wire that no one ever bothered to repair. On the sidewalks, heads turned as he passed, and though he didn't return the looks, he felt them. Some curious, some admiring, others waited with something less easy to define. He was used to it. A black man in a six-figure car never moved through the world unnoticed. Still, the way a pair of construction workers paused at the intersection and exchanged a knowing glance as he rolled by wasn't lost on him. He didn't speed, didn't weave, didn't do anything that could be mistaken for showboating. His turns were signaled. His stops were full. His hands remained at 10 and 2 because even now, even after all he had done for this country, there was a part of him that knew better than to give anyone an excuse. So when he saw the cruiser pull in behind him 2 blocks later, he didn't panic. He simply noted the presence the way a hunter notes the sound of a branch snapping deep in the woods. An instinct sharpened by repetition, not paranoia. The black and white followed at a steady distance for the next block. Then the lights came on in a flicker of red and blue, the quick bark of a siren rising once before cutting off. Darius exhaled, eased the Aston to the curb, and turned down the jazz with a flick of his fingers. His hands stayed visible on the wheel. His posture remained calm. It was a familiar dance, and he knew every step. The driver's side door of the cruiser opened with a mechanical groan. 2 officers stepped out, both white, one stocky with sunburned skin and a resting scowl, the other leaner, younger, and already wearing a smirk that suggested he thought he knew everything he needed to. Neither of them spoke until they reached the car. "License and registration," the older one said, voice flat and unimpressed, as though he'd just woken from a nap and resented being given work. Darius nodded slightly. "License is in my wallet, back pocket. Registration's in the glove box. I'm reaching for them now, slowly." "Go ahead," the younger one said, shifting his stance to better see inside. He moved with deliberate calm, retrieved the documents, and passed them out the window. The older officer snatched them, barely glanced at the name, and handed them off to his partner without comment. "This your car?" the younger one asked, scanning the registration. "Yes," Darius answered. "Just picked it up yesterday." The cop raised an eyebrow, skeptical. "Cash like this doesn't usually move through this part of town." "It does when I drive it," Darius said evenly. "I just wrapped a federal contract. Decided to celebrate." The older officer stepped in again, arms crossed, gaze unreadable. "What kind of contract?" "Cybersecurity," Darius replied. "I work with sensitive systems. That's as much as I can say." The answer wasn't good enough. It never was. The badge didn't matter. The language didn't matter. All they saw was the color of his skin against the shine of the vehicle. "We've had reports of stolen luxury vehicles in the area," the older cop said, already signaling to the other. "Mind stepping out so we can run a few checks?" "You've got the paperwork," Darius replied. "There's nothing stolen here." "That wasn't a request," the younger one said, the smirk gone now, replaced by the thin line of someone enjoying the illusion of control. Darius stared at them both, jaw tight, then slowly opened the door. As he stepped out, he felt it coming. The shift in the air, the posture of readiness in their shoulders, the threat beneath the words. He kept his hands visible. He didn't resist, but he didn't cower either. "I suggest you check the registration," he said, voice firm, "because what you're doing right now isn't procedure, it's profiling." The older cop didn't flinch. "Turn around." Hands on the hood. Darius hesitated for just a breath, enough to let them know he saw it, all of it, then did as he was told. The cuffs dug into the bone of his wrists, not painfully, not enough to leave marks, but just tight enough to send a message. The older officer's grip was practiced, mechanical, and devoid of humanity, the motion executed with the cold detachment of someone who had long since stopped seeing people, especially certain people, as people. Darius remained still, shoulders squared against the weight of the moment, body obedient but never submissive. He didn't resist, not because he couldn't, but because resistance would have given them exactly what they were looking for. He had already given them enough. As he stood pressed against the hood of the car, face inches from the burning metal, his eyes caught the names on their uniforms. Kavanaugh stitched over the older one's chest, and Heller on the younger. The knowledge clicked into place immediately, silently, without outward reaction. Brent Kavanaugh, Will Heller. Both names had surfaced once before, buried in a spreadsheet of questionable seizure reports linked to a department flagged by Homeland. At the time, the thread hadn't led anywhere definitive. Now it had a face. 2. "Thought you'd talk your way out of this, huh?" Heller muttered, rummaging through the center console of the car with a smirk that reeked of practiced condescension. "You boys love to play smooth until the cuffs come out." Darius didn't turn his head. "I complied with every request. You had no probable cause." Kavanaugh let out a low chuckle behind him. Not amused, but contemptuous. "Listen to this guy. Probably went to college on a scholarship, thinks he's too smart to get caught." Darius tilted his chin, his gaze fixed straight ahead. "No. I'm too clean to get caught." "Is that right?" Kavanaugh stepped in closer, lowering his voice. "Then why do you look like every other suspect we've hauled in this week?" There it was. Bare, ugly, not even an attempt to dress it up in euphemism. "You're profiling me," Darius said calmly, his voice level, controlled. "And you're doing it so badly you didn't even check the paperwork before deciding you'd make an example out of me." "Paperwork's got errors," Heller snapped, too fast to sound convincing. "That's on you." "I watched you take photos of the VIN and the tags," Darius continued, his voice still cool, still precise. "I saw your tow truck get into position before either of you made a call. Either this is your standard procedure, or you're working for someone who's running a racket." Kavanaugh moved in front of him now, face too close, his expression curdled with challenge. "What did you say?" "I said you're not as in control of this situation as you think." Kavanaugh shoved him against the hood, harder this time, the move all aggression and no professionalism. The jolt rattled Darius's bones, but he didn't cry out or flinch. His fingers tensed behind his back, then relaxed again. "Watch your mouth," Kavanaugh growled. "You think that tone's gonna help you? You act like you're better than us, like you deserve something." "I do," Darius said, and for the first time a trace of steel entered his voice. "I deserve not to be stripped, searched, and humiliated on the side of the street for owning a car I earned." Heller laughed without humor. "Man really thinks he bought that car with a laptop and a LinkedIn account." "More like a handout," Kavanaugh added. "I'm guessing some DC office needed their quota filled. You're not special, just a name they can check off a list." Darius stayed silent. He let the venom fall uselessly around him, absorbing nothing. He'd heard versions of this before, in boardrooms, courtrooms, customs halls, and briefing rooms dressed up to look fair. They never expected him to know how to listen without being moved. Heller slammed the car door closed. "Nothing in the car, not a thing. He travels light." "Yeah, well," Kavanaugh said, "he won't be traveling in that." Across the street, the impound truck was already backing up toward the curb, moving with the lazy confidence of a man who knew he wouldn't be questioned. The driver, middle-aged, wide-bellied, and wearing a grease-streaked vest, barely looked at the officers before locking the winch and extending the ramp. The Aston's nose tilted as it was drawn upward, the chain clinking against chrome like shackles. As Darius watched the ascent in the car's reflection across a storefront window, he caught the unmistakable flash of Heller pulling out his phone again. Snap. Snap. 2 more photos. Angles that captured the plate, the VIN, and the interior. Those weren't for evidence. That was inventory. The car was already marked for transfer, filed, processed, and, in a few days, gone. Wiped clean and sold back into the system under a shell title with a new badge and no trace of its origins. Kavanaugh undid the cuffs at last, not gently, but without violence, as if touching Darius longer than necessary might somehow soil his hands. "There's no arrest," he said. "Not today. So don't run your mouth, and maybe you keep your car next time you think about rolling through here in that kind of machine." Darius flexed his fingers, the circulation prickling back into his palms. He didn't speak right away. He adjusted his shirt cuffs, smoothed out the shoulders of his shirt, and squared his stance. Only then did he glance toward them, his expression unreadable. "Clock's ticking, boys," he murmured, soft enough to be dismissed, sharp enough to be remembered. "What was that?" Heller asked, his smile uncertain now. But Darius was already turning away, his gait unhurried, hands in his pockets, posture straight. Once he turned the corner, far from their sight, he reached into his sock and drew out the encrypted black device no one had searched for. The screen lit silently. One tap sent a signal through Homeland's deep network, activating a quiet alarm buried in the vehicle's surveillance system. GPS, audio, VN tracking, all lit green. In an unmarked room 3 states away, the system flagged an active trace. He took the bait, a technician said to no one in particular. And on a quiet street with no car and no apology, Darius walked forward, not defeated, not shaken, but quietly satisfied. The only question now was how far the corruption ran. The officers were just the beginning. The system they worked for was about to be exposed. The sun had barely dipped beneath the skyline when Darius entered through the security doors of the Homeland Intelligence substation, buried beneath a logistics building that wore the dull disguise of a private shipping firm. No signs, no badge scanners visible from the street, just one camera tucked into the corner of an awning and a reinforced door that only opened when the right eyes stared into the right lens. He had walked the same hallway 100 times before, but something in his posture tonight was different. The suit was gone, replaced with dark tactical denim and a fitted black shirt. His watch had been swapped out for a field-grade comband. His shoulders, while still composed, carried more weight now, something invisible and older than today's humiliation. A steel door slid open at the end of the hall, revealing a dimly lit control room where satellite feeds, vehicle logs, communications intercepts, and facial recognition scans danced across a wall of monitors like a digital storm in slow motion. The hum of quiet tech filled the air, and 3 analysts worked in silence at their stations, lit only by the glow of their screens. No one looked up when Darius entered, but the room's energy shifted, as if his presence had adjusted the current. "Welcome back," said a voice from behind one of the angled terminals. Agent Lila Torres stepped out from the shadows of the adjacent data bay, a tablet in one hand and a headset clipped to her shoulder. Her dark hair was pulled back in a low braid, and her expression carried the thin veneer of sarcasm she wore whenever she didn't like what she was seeing. "You're late," she said, without looking at him, eyes scanning the screen as the GPS marker for the Aston Martin pinged its new location in the impound database. "And they took the car faster than we estimated." 10 minutes flat from cuffs to flatbed. Darius pulled out the encrypted phone, dropped it on the table beside her, and crossed to the mission board along the far wall. "They skipped every protocol," he said, pulling up a holographic interface and activating the map. "Didn't run the plates, didn't log the stop. Truck was waiting before they even unholstered. Vian's already been photographed twice. That car's not going into evidence. It's being sorted." Lila finally looked at him. "You all right?" "I'm fine." "You don't look fine." He didn't respond, not directly. Instead, he zoomed in on the center of the map, where 5 red dots glowed in a cluster along a corridor of impound lots and private garages spanning 3 counties. Each dot represented a vehicle that had been seized under questionable pretext, rerouted through falsified paperwork, and sold at closed-door auctions to buyers with criminal affiliations the local PD claimed not to know existed. Darius tapped the largest dot, an impound lot east of the city, and brought up a list of seizure reports. 37 vehicles, he said quietly. All luxury. All drivers black or Latino. 0 indictments filed. No charges. Just investigation ongoing. And a trail of paper thin enough to blow away in a strong breeze. Lila stepped closer. And every one of them ends up at the same auction house in Calvert Hills. Same shell buyer. Same forged registrations. She flipped the tablet to reveal a looping surveillance image of a warehouse entrance where cars disappeared, but were never seen exiting. How has no one up the chain noticed this? They noticed, Darius said. They just didn't care. Or they were paid not to. The screen updated again, this time pulling satellite footage of the red Aston arriving at the impound. Darius watched as the truck backed in, unhooked the vehicle, and left without ever logging the drop. A man in civilian clothes with no visible badge scanned the VN and placed a clipboard over the dashboard for a few seconds, long enough for a mobile scanner to pull full diagnostics. No forms, no cameras, just efficient erasure. Lila turned to face him more directly now, arms folded. "And you still want to let them run the play?" Let the car move up the ladder and hope we catch the right guy holding the keys. Darius met her gaze. That's the plan. It was the plan 2 months ago, before they dragged you out of your own car at gunpoint. He exhaled through his nose. Not quite a sigh. Not quite anger. Just the trace of something older than this case. They didn't drag me out, he said. I let them. You let them put you in cuffs and take the car without pushing it? I had to know if Kavanaugh and Heller were active. Now I know. Lila's voice dropped. You're not just tracking a seizure ring anymore, Darius. You're circling ghosts. These guys are wired to Monahan's precinct. Monahan has friends in the courthouse. If they figure out you're watching, this gets buried. You get buried. He looked back at the screen, at the blinking signal that represented his stolen car, now sitting in the belly of a corrupted machine. His face was calm, but the storm behind it, carefully caged, was far from settled. My father used to drive a Lincoln Town car, he said, almost offhand. Worked the night shift at the bottling plant. Drove that thing until the wheels shook on the freeway. It was his pride. Only thing he really owned that wasn't a lease or pawned at some point. Lila said nothing. Cops pulled him over one night after work. Said it matched a stolen vehicle report. He tried to explain. Showed his pay stub, his license. Didn't matter. They took the car. Told him to come to court if he wanted it back. What happened? He couldn't afford the court fees. Didn't matter anyway. Car was gone in a week. Towed, sold, scrapped or flipped. He never saw it again. She was quiet for a beat longer this time. So, this is about more than the case. Darius looked at her then, his expression sharper, colder. This was always about more than the case. The hum of servers echoed softly through the operations center, a low and constant pulse beneath the tension now thickening between the walls. Hours had passed since the red Aston had been towed, and it had moved twice already. First to the impound lot in East End, then again to a storage facility listed under a city department that hadn't existed for more than 2 years. The file claimed it was a satellite lot, used temporarily during facility maintenance, but no logs had been updated and no staff had signed in since last March. The address existed in the system, but the people did not. Darius stood at the primary display, arms crossed, watching the vehicle's signal blink slowly on the screen. Its motion was calm now, still for nearly an hour, parked in a wide industrial yard just south of the Beltway. Surveillance feeds from a drone circling above showed an expanse of cracked asphalt and chain-link fencing, ringed by portable trailers and shipping containers, none of them marked. 2 black SUVs were parked at the far end, both with municipal plates, but neither registered through any government fleet channel. Leela stood behind him, tablet in hand, scrubbing through audio logs captured from inside the Aston's cabin. The first hour had been quiet, idle chatter between the impound operator and someone on a burner phone, mostly mechanical. But just before the car had arrived at its final stop, something new had come through. A low voice, male, clipped with purpose and in no hurry. 2 days, the voice said. That's how long I can sit on it. After that, it's going into rotation. Got it, another man replied. Title already moved. Buyers ready. That was it. Nothing more. But it was enough. Darius tapped the screen, zooming in on the lot's border. They're fast. We knew they had help. But this level of efficiency means they're running a full cycle. Identification, seizure, inventory, title forgery, and transfer within 72 hours. Less, if they've already got a buyer waiting, Lila added, eyes still locked on the transcript. And if the car was flagged before they even pulled you over, it means someone's feeding them plate data directly from DMV systems. That's not beat cop work. It's not precinct level either, Darius said, bringing up a secondary map on the table's interface. This yard is city property, on paper. But the lease was signed by a private security firm 6 months ago. Shell Company. No corporate filings. One of the names attached to the Articles of Incorporation shows up in an older DEA surveillance package from the Durango corridor cases, linked to a suspect flagged for cartel movement in and out of Texas. Which suspect? Lila asked, stepping closer. Darius pulled up the file. The image that appeared on screen showed a man in his 50s, salt and pepper hair, sharp eyes, uniformed and smiling behind a podium at a police graduation ceremony. Captain Reese Monahan, a name familiar to every officer in the state. Publicly, he was the definition of command. Decorated, untouchable, and photographed more times in front of the flag than any politician in the region. But the document on the screen now told a different story. 2 years prior, his name had appeared in a DEA memo, buried in a web of names tied to a vehicle trafficking pipeline. No evidence had ever linked him directly, but his signature had surfaced on a requisition order connected to an impounded Porsche that never reached the lot. They buried it, Lila murmured, reading the report. Redacted before the inquiry ever got traction. Of course they did, Darius said, not surprised. He's too high profile. They'd need hard proof to take a swing at him. And whoever he's working with now, they've gotten smarter. The Aston's GPS pinged again, showing a slight movement, barely a shift, but enough to suggest it had been rolled into a different spot within the yard. Darius watched as one of the warehouse doors in the drone feed opened, and a crew of 3 stepped inside. 2 of them were in plain clothes. The third wore the insignia of the City Tow Division, but the uniform was too new, and the badge number didn't match any employee records. They weren't impound staff. They were handlers. "We've got 36 hours before that car disappears," Lila said. "What's the move?" "We let it go," Darius replied. Lila raised an eyebrow, but he was already turning back toward the screen. "They'll push it through the shell. That's the point. We let it flow to whoever's buying. That's the node we want. And what if it lands in Mexico or gets stripped for parts in Newark?" "It won't," he said. "They've gone quiet. That means the car is marked, just not for scrap. Someone's waiting for delivery." He tapped another file open. The most recent auction registry scraped from the dark net listed a 2024 Aston Martin DB11, cherry red, with no reserve and clean documentation guaranteed. Registered under a numbered shell out of Panama. Buyer's details encrypted, naturally. But Darius had seen the signature formatting before. Same handler tags, same catalog phrasing. It was the same group they'd been chasing for 9 months, only now the car they were pushing wasn't random. It was his. He followed the listing into the block trace logs, flipping through data until something caught his eye. "Got a name," he said slowly. Cross-referenced payment channels. One of the deposits for the Aston came from a proxy account tagged in the Raptor Cell briefings last year. Lila leaned in. Those files were black access. Only 3 of us pulled that string. Darius didn't answer. She stared at the screen, then back at him. "Who accessed them?" He hesitated for just a moment. Then he pulled up the access log. Only one name showed on the authorization list outside of Darius's own. Torres. Lila stared at the screen for a moment, unmoving, then blinked once, slow, confused, not yet angry, but dangerously close. "That's impossible," she said. Darius didn't say anything. "I didn't pull Raptor Cell. I've never even had cause to open that folder." He studied her carefully, not with suspicion, but with the eyes of a man who'd spent too long in a world where no name was ever clean forever. "Then someone wants us to think you did," he said, "which means they're either setting you up or watching us both." She didn't look away. "Either way, we just got marked." He nodded once, slowly, and stared at the blinking red icon on the screen. The stolen car that had just become more dangerous in someone else's hands than it ever had been in his. They didn't speak again that night, not in the way that counted. The silence between them wasn't hostile, but it was no longer companionable either. It had changed shape, filled with the quiet friction of doubt. Darius returned to the operations suite long after Lila had gone to her assigned bunk, claiming exhaustion but taking her tablet with her. He made no comment about it. He simply waited until the building settled into its quiet rhythm. The overhead fluorescents dimmed to their night cycle low, and the analysts in the adjacent room switched to quiet conversation over coffee and screen glare. Then he requested the archives. He worked alone. The footage he pulled was raw and unsorted. Files scraped from traffic cams, precinct security systems, courthouse CCTV feeds, and off-grid city surveillance drones that weren't supposed to be active but never truly shut down. It took him nearly 2 hours to locate the date he was looking for, then another 40 minutes to align the angles, cross-reference timestamps, and find a clip buried deep in an unrelated file tagged for narcotics review. It was grainy footage, recorded from a municipal drone parked 2 blocks away from a precinct on the west side of the city, where Monahan had maintained his command post until his recent promotion. The camera caught the edge of the building's parking lot, just enough to track faces moving in and out of a rear entrance that most officers didn't use. Darius enhanced the timestamp, adjusted the contrast, and leaned in closer. Captain Monahan stood with his back to the camera, flanked by 2 officers in plain clothes. But it was the woman facing him that made Darius go still. The image wasn't perfect, just a slightly tilted frame, half-shadowed and distorted by a light flare, but it was her. Lila Torres, hair tied back. Same stance. Same leather satchel she still carried into briefings. She wasn't wearing a Homeland badge that day. She wasn't even officially part of the agency's field task roster yet. They weren't speaking casually. The posture was too square, too formal. She stood as if being briefed or debriefed. Monahan's gestures were pointed and directive, and although Darius had no audio to draw from, he didn't need it. He knew body language. He had spent his life learning what people meant by how they stood, how they tilted their heads, how they used their hands. This wasn't a chance meeting. This wasn't small talk. This was an exchange. He didn't react outwardly. He didn't even blink. He saved the footage, flagged it under a secure directory, and encrypted it twice. He didn't mention it to anyone the following morning. He didn't confront her when she arrived for the early morning operational review, and he didn't let his tone change when he updated her on the progress of the Aston's trace. He remained as calm, as precise, and as surgical as always. But inside, a quiet split had begun to form, one he would not show until he had proof strong enough to shatter trust without doubt. At 06:17, the Aston's signal reappeared. It had left the previous impound location hours earlier, vanishing into the kind of dead zone that suggested GPS shielding. Now it had surfaced again, parked inside a reinforced structure tagged in an older file as a suspected cartel stronghold, one of the clean warehouses used as a mid-tier hub between seizures and final auction deliveries. The location was fortified, shielded from most scanning, and tucked behind a commercial shipping front registered to a logistics company dissolved 3 years ago. The aerial drone dispatched over the site was already transmitting. The footage that came through was sharp enough to freeze the room. 3 cartel security vehicles parked in a semicircle around the building. Armed guards patrolled the exterior in regular sweeps, wearing tactical gear that wasn't standard issue but mirrored military structure. Plate carriers, encrypted radios, forward grips. 2 interior bay doors were half open, enough to show crates stacked high and forklifts moving with controlled purpose. And there, parked just inside the inner dock, was the red Aston Martin. Darius stared at it for a long moment. It was pristine. It hadn't been stripped, lifted, or even wiped down. That alone was significant. They hadn't sold it. They were holding it. That made it leverage. That made it bait. "Are they prepping to move it again?" Lila asked, her voice low but steady. "No," Darius replied, watching the movement of the guards. "They're nesting." She frowned. "Why keep the car at a logistics hub?" "Because the car is proof," he said. "They need to verify it's still intact before final handoff. That means someone important's coming. Not a buyer. Someone from inside." Her voice dropped lower. "You think Monahan might show?" "I think whoever shows, they won't be street level." The decision didn't take long. By mid-morning, the Homeland and ATF liaison team had begun prepping a coordinated breach. The site was mapped, roles assigned, and entry points reviewed from aerial and structural layouts. The plan was built not for containment, but for resolution. The agency was no longer just observing. They were moving in. Darius led the briefing himself, standing at the head of the table in a windowless room where too many operations had begun with maps and ended with body bags. He pointed out the gaps in the perimeter coverage, the pattern of guard rotation, the likely staging area for the car, and the secondary stash zones that would need to be secured before any data could be recovered. He emphasized that the Aston must not be touched. It was to be retrieved intact, with all internal surveillance hardware preserved. "Intel takes priority," he said. "But if we encounter resistance, lethal force is authorized. We do not let anyone walk." Across the table, Lila watched him with a face unreadable and a silence that carried its own weight. When the meeting ended and the agents began to file out, she didn't move. Darius paused beside her chair. She didn't look up. "I know what I saw," he said. Finally, her eyes met his. "Then you know what I was walking away from." He studied her a beat longer. "You should have told me. I didn't know I'd have to." That was all either of them said. Outside, the sun continued its slow crawl across a cloudless sky, casting the city in the stark, dry light of late morning. Traffic pulsed in its usual rhythms, sirens came and went in the distance, and the people in the streets went about their lives unaware that a different kind of order had already begun to shift beneath them. Inside Homeland's substation, the tempo of movement changed. Analysts passed printouts and coordinates with clipped urgency, weapons were signed out and checked with silent precision, and tactical teams cycled through briefings like gears locking into place. The warehouse identified as the cartel's storage hub had been verified. Its structural blueprint matched with drone footage, and all access routes had been logged. Everything that could be learned about the facility had been absorbed. Now, the only thing left to do was move. The official cover for the raid was a multi-agency joint operation on suspected narcotics trafficking, routed through the Department of Justice and timed to coincide with a jurisdictional handoff between the city police and federal task forces. Darius had ensured the local precinct would be nowhere near the scene. He wasn't about to give Monahan, or anyone under his command, the chance to clean house before the doors were breached. In the pre-dawn hours, Darius stood beside a reinforced transport van parked beneath the overpass 2 blocks from the target building. He was dressed in black tactical gear, same as the rest of the team, but where others carried sidearms and flash grenades clipped to their chests, he moved lighter, his weapons concealed, his tools silent. He wasn't the tip of the spear. He was the blade already inside the body. Lila checked the magazine on her sidearm and glanced across the transport at him. "You want the car pulled first?" she asked. "No," Darius said, without looking away from the screen mounted inside the van. The live drone feed still showed 2 men guarding the warehouse entrance, both armed with short-barrel rifles. "If we go for the Aston too fast, they'll know it's more than a standard sweep," Assuming they don't already. He finally turned to her, face unreadable beneath the tension of the moment. They don't, he said. If they did, it'd already be gone. The radio clicked twice. The perimeter was in position. The second team was moving into place at the rear gate. The sound of boots on concrete, of breath caught in chest plates and radios crackling beneath whispers, filled the dark with anticipation. Darius checked his comms, adjusted his earpiece, and signaled once with his hand. The team moved. The approach was fast and clean. The first breach came from the side wall, where ATF agents used a portable breaching unit to punch through the metal and concrete seam with a jolt of compressed air and shaped explosive. The explosion wasn't deafening, but it was enough to shatter the calm. Lights snapped on inside the warehouse. Voices shouted in Spanish, sharp and panicked, and within seconds, gunfire burst from behind the loading docks. The firefight began in a fury of muzzle flashes and shouting. Bullets struck steel and concrete, sparks dancing off forklifts and loading rigs. Darius moved through it all like smoke, slipping between columns and crates, with the kind of calm born not from recklessness, but from absolute precision. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He simply moved, through shadow and haze, gun raised only when needed, never wasting a motion. He flanked two armed guards near the mezzanine stairwell, catching them just as they tried to reposition. A double tap dropped the first. The second went down, trying to draw. Darius didn't hesitate. He was already gone before the bodies hit the floor. Over the radio, Lila's voice came through, sharp and controlled. West side cleared. Moving to the storage floor. Darius advanced toward the vehicle bay, where half the facility's lighting had been knocked out from the breach. The scene glowed in half-light, flickering fluorescence overhead, the dull orange of emergency exit signs blinking through the smoke. The Aston sat at the far end of the space, untouched. Its body gleamed faintly, a splash of blood-red elegance against the grime and chaos of the room around it. No dents. No broken glass. Tires still full. Doors locked. Not a single scuff on the finish. It hadn't been driven. It hadn't even been opened. Just shifted, as if someone wanted it visible. Ready, but not disturbed. A shout rang out to his left. Darius spun, dropped low, and fired. The guard fell, dropping his weapon across a spilled crate of forged titles and spare license plates. He pushed forward, scanning for secondary threats, and saw movement along the far wall. A runner making for a steel door marked Office. Darius gave chase, boots hitting the concrete with rhythmic, controlled force. He reached the office just as the man inside tried to bolt the door. With one powerful kick, Darius broke through, sending the man sprawling backward into a desk littered with burner phones, cash bands, and what looked like a full manifest of vehicles processed through the Shell auction. He didn't speak. He didn't ask questions. He zip-tied the man's wrists and pulled his comms offline. Behind him, Lila entered the room with two ATF agents in tow. One of them gestured toward the files. "We'll need this boxed up for evidence. Full inventory sweep." Lila's eyes landed on a monitor still blinking on the desk. It showed camera feeds, 4 warehouse angles, and, strangely, one interior view of the Aston's cabin. Darius stepped beside her. "That's not our feed," she said, her voice quiet. "No," he said. "It's theirs." He stared at the angle for a long moment. The camera was tucked inside the rearview mirror. Not the one they'd planted. Something newer. Something not part of their operation. Someone else had bugged the car. And someone else had been watching them the entire time. The realization landed like a blade in the dark. "This wasn't just a laundering depot," Darius said. "This was a relay point." Lila turned toward him, her eyes sharp now. "You think the car was bait?" "I think it still is." Behind them, More agents moved into the building, the firefight over, the noise fading into the sound of radios and boots and whispered reports. But in the center of the chaos, the Aston Martin remained untouched, immaculate, a silent witness to something none of them had yet seen coming. Darius stepped closer to the car and stared into the mirrored surface of the driver's side window. For a second, he saw himself reflected there. Weapon lowered, face lit by smoke and neon, eyes catching something he couldn't yet name. The sound of gunfire hadn't fully faded when the second wave of shouts rose from the eastern wing of the warehouse. Darius turned instinctively, his hand tightening around the grip of his sidearm as a series of sharp pops echoed down the corridor lined with stacked freight containers. It wasn't return fire. It was a distraction, too staggered and distant to be tactical. This was movement. Someone was trying to slip out under the cover of the last dying chaos. He moved quickly, cutting across the warehouse floor, stepping over splintered crates and brass shell casings still warm to the touch. As he approached the far exit, the sharp staccato rhythm of boots on metal stairs told him what he needed to know. Someone was headed to the secondary service exit, the one hidden behind a maintenance door that had remained untouched for the duration of the raid. The exit wasn't marked. It wasn't on any official diagram, but Darius knew it existed because he had authorized the operational schematic himself. He moved faster now. Turning the corner, he caught the edge of motion. 3 figures in black, moving with coordinated efficiency, too clean for cartel muscle. The tallest of the 3 paused just long enough to turn and fire a burst in his direction, bullets carving a sharp arc into the wall behind him. Darius dropped to one knee, returned fire once, and saw the muzzle flash scatter as the figures slipped out the door and into the alley. He followed. The air outside was cold and sharp, a jarring contrast to the thick warmth of the warehouse. Tires screeched on concrete as a black SUV pulled from the shadows, its engine already gunning. Darius reached the alley mouth in time to see the vehicle disappear around the corner, but not before catching the silhouettes inside. 3 men. One with silver hair and a solid build. One with a squared jaw and a visible neck tattoo. One lean, fast, grinning like the night was a game he was winning. Monahan? Kavanaugh? Heller? He didn't fire. Not into the dark. Not at a vehicle already disappearing. But he didn't lower his weapon either. Behind him, Lila arrived with 2 agents in tow. Her eyes went straight to the exit. "They got out?" she asked, her breath fast, clipped. "Used a service corridor," Darius replied, voice low. "Wasn't on the public map." She narrowed her eyes. They knew the layout? They knew it too well. They used code-cleared exits, internal paths. She stepped closer, catching his tone. "You're saying someone gave them Homeland schematics?" "I'm saying someone gave them my schematics." Leela opened her mouth, but Darius was already turning back toward the building. They didn't speak until the bodies had been cleared and the rooms secured. No further gunfire. No survivors with names that meant anything. Only static in the comms and a pile of weapons traced to cartel caches in Houston and El Paso. No one had claimed the Aston. No one had mentioned Monahan, Kavanaugh, or Heller by name. And yet, they had been there. They had run. And they had done it too cleanly for chance. Back inside the operations van, the air was close, thick with tension and blood, and the dry crackle of comm chatter. Darius stood with both hands pressed against the edge of the central table, watching the feed loop on the overhead screen, the SUV's exit, the blurred plates, the brief freeze frame of Monahan's face, lit by the dashboard before the vehicle vanished. Lila stepped into the van and shut the door behind her. "You think I tipped them," she said flatly. He didn't answer. She moved closer, arms crossed now, shoulders tense. "Say it, Darius. You've been carrying it since yesterday." Say it. You met with Monahan before this task force even existed, he said, not raising his voice. You accessed black clearance files I never assigned. And the night we move on a raid I personally structured, they escape through routes only someone inside this van would know about. And that someone has to be me. You're the only variable. She stepped closer, voice tighter now, the hurt bleeding through the anger. Do you hear yourself? You think I'd put my name on a dirty exit? You think I'd stand beside you through months of operations, put my life on the line, take bullets with you, just to tip off the same bastards we've been hunting? I think you kept things from me, Darius said. And I think this operation has cracks bigger than either of us can patch with loyalty. Lila laughed once, cold and sharp. You're not chasing Monahan anymore. You're chasing your past. You're seeing your father on every street corner, in every uniform, in every decision I make that doesn't line up with your pain. The words landed hard, sharper than gunfire. For a moment, the room went still. He looked at her, eyes narrowing not in rage, but in something deeper. Betrayal wrapped in doubt. And what if I am, he said. What if that pain is the only thing keeping me from turning into the kind of man we're hunting? She didn't answer. Not right away. I didn't tip them, she said finally. But someone did. Someone with clearance. Someone close. He didn't look away. Then we find them. And when we do? He paused. Then we decide who's still standing at the end. The meeting with Internal Affairs was never on the books. It didn't pass through dispatch or scheduling. It didn't trigger any surveillance alerts or digital pings. It was arranged through a code embedded in a classified database, buried so deep it required 2 verification protocols and a secure line routed through an international node. The kind of contact that could only be reached if you already knew what to ask and exactly how to ask it. The cafe was tucked away in a hollowed-out corner of an aging industrial park, 2 counties outside the city. The awning was sun-bleached, the windows clouded with the grime of years without care, and the sign above the door simply read, Gina's, though no one named Gina had worked there in over a decade. It was the kind of place that didn't belong to the present, where time seemed to slow out of stubbornness, and regulars came not for food, but for familiarity. Darius sat in the back booth, facing the door out of habit, the vinyl seat worn down to a gray shine. The smell of old coffee lingered, heavy with the scent of fryer oil and melted sugar. He didn't order anything. He never did here. The man who slid into the opposite seat wore a windbreaker, jeans, and the vague look of someone who could disappear into a crowd and never be remembered. His name was Paul Hadley, a veteran of Internal Affairs, and one of the few people Darius trusted enough to call when the lines between justice and politics blurred too far. You look tired, Hadley said without looking up. Darius didn't smile. You get the files? Hadley reached into his coat and pulled a slim drive no bigger than a coin. He slid it across the table between them without ceremony. I had to back-channel the request, he said. Monahan's personnel file isn't just restricted. It's been burned. Darius frowned. Define burned. Hadley leaned back, his voice lowering. As in, wiped from all primary Homeland archives. No incident logs, no commendations, no evaluations for the last 3 years. His record jumps straight from his promotion to precinct captain to a blank index. The only way I even knew something was missing was because the redaction itself was sloppy. There are time gaps in the internal audit trail. Someone tried to make it look clean, but didn't know how to mask the log echoes. Who authorized the override? Hadley's eyes flicked up for the first time. That's the part that'll keep you up at night. Darius didn't flinch. Homeland, Hadley continued. Not local? Not city level. National clearance override. Code red. Director level access? That's the only tier capable of ghosting a personnel file across multiple federal databases without triggering a flag. Darius said nothing, fingers tapping lightly against the edge of the table. It wasn't the override that disturbed him. It was how old it was. Someone at Homeland had buried Monahan years before this operation even began, and that meant the corruption didn't start with these seizures. It started much earlier, and it had been protected by someone with the power to keep it alive. Hadley leaned forward. "You were right to keep this quiet, Darius. But if I were you, I'd start watching the Watchers. You think you're running an op? Turns out, you're inside one." Darius took the drive and stood without another word. Outside, the sky had shifted, clouds gathering in slow, ominous layers. The drive in his hand felt heavier than its size allowed, not because of its contents, but because of what it meant. Someone inside Homeland had cleared Monahan's path, scrubbed his mistakes, and left him free to orchestrate everything from inside the system without ever drawing attention. The question wasn't just who was behind it. It was who still knew. Hours later, Darius sat alone in his apartment, one of 3 safe units he rotated between, and scrubbed through old field recordings. Not the official surveillance logs, but the side-channel audio captured during stakeouts, briefings, and car rides. Moments no one had thought to clean or redact because no one had believed they mattered. He was halfway through a recording from 6 weeks earlier when the phrase slipped through the speakers like a quiet whisper across glass. "Focus the narrative, D." That's what Nash always said. You don't control the truth. You shape the part people can live with. Darius paused the playback. The voice was Lila's. Calm, casual, like she'd said it 100 times before. But it wasn't the phrasing that chilled him. It was the source. Director Samuel Nash had once been Darius's mentor before his promotion took him so high up the chain that his signature only appeared on classified orders and closed-door mission audits. Nash had been gone from fieldwork for years. Only a handful of people still quoted him. People who had worked under him closely. People who had known the way he thought, the way he spoke, the way he taught others to bend perception in the name of operational success. Lila had never served under Nash. She had come from a different division. She had no cause to know that line. But maybe she'd encountered his doctrine during early Inspector General briefings, before her assignment intersected with Darius's. Quoting him wasn't affection. It was recognition. Unless she had been closer to Nash than she'd ever admitted. Darius leaned back slowly, the weight of that realization threading itself into everything he'd once thought he could count on. Maybe she had never lied. Maybe she hadn't leaked the files. But there were other forms of compromise. Proximity, influence, connections left unsaid. If Nash had looped her in before she'd been assigned to Darius's task force, if she had come in already briefed on Monahan, already aware of the deeper stakes, then the playing field had never been even. She wasn't just his partner. She might have been his handler. Or worse, his distraction. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere in the distance, not loud, but enough to vibrate the window pane. Darius rose from his seat and moved toward the file cabinet bolted into the floor. From the locked drawer, he retrieved an old dossier, one of Nash's closed cases, flagged years ago during a narcotics investigation that had never made it to prosecution. At the time, it had seemed like just another failure. But now, with the name Monahan threaded through it like a silent code, it read like something else. A buried warning. A blueprint. He opened the folder, eyes scanning the names, the signatures, the redacted lines. The paper still smelled like dust and ink and old betrayal. And somewhere in those pages, he knew, was the next move. Because this wasn't just about the cars anymore. It was about who wanted them to matter, and who needed them to disappear. The folder didn't give him answers so much as it confirmed the weight of a suspicion that had been building in Darius like pressure behind glass. Each name, each redacted signature, each silent omission shouted louder than any confession. Monahan's rise had been engineered, insulated by authorization codes that traced back to Homeland. Yes, but more specifically, to a signature Darius had only ever seen once before, at the bottom of an internal audit summary 4 years prior, back when he was still green enough to believe in the chain of command. Director Samuel Nash. There it was. Not hidden, not buried deep, just placed in plain sight, relying on the fact that no one would ever think to look. Nash had authorized the wipe on Monahan's records. He had circumvented protocol with a code-red override, one that had only ever been used in classified international trafficking cases. On paper, it had looked like internal reorganization. In reality, it had paved the way for an alliance that could never exist publicly. Homeland intel in exchange for protected smuggling routes, in exchange for career advancement, in exchange for power. Darius stared at the folder, not moving, not even blinking. The betrayal didn't burn. It chilled, settling deep in his bones with the precision of an old, clean incision reopened without anesthesia. Nash hadn't just manipulated Monahan into running the vehicle seizure ring. He had let it fester, grown it, weaponized it. And Darius had been the fuse, the pullover, the seizure of the Aston, the impound transfer, even the leak that cast suspicion on Lila. All of it had been orchestrated not to destroy the operation, but to force it into motion. Nash hadn't wanted to dismantle Monahan. He'd wanted to bait him. And Darius's anger, his trauma, his unrelenting drive for justice, that was the engine Nash had counted on. And it had worked. A soft knock at the door broke the stillness. Darius looked up to find Lila standing just inside the threshold, her expression unreadable, her arms loose at her sides. She didn't speak at first, only walked to the table and glanced down at the open folder. Her gaze stopped on the authorization code printed at the bottom of the last page. "You found it," she said quietly. Darius didn't move. "You already knew?" She nodded, just once. "I didn't know the full scope. Not until today. And you didn't tell me." "I couldn't," she said, voice steady but without challenge. "I'm deep cover. Inspector General's office. Black file operations. My assignment wasn't to stop the ring. It was to confirm who in Homeland authorized it. I was embedded before you were ever pulled into this. And the minute Nash greenlit you for field work again, I knew something was wrong." He turned toward her now, the fury just beneath his stillness sharp enough to bite. "So you watched," he said. "You followed. You listened. You heard them put a gun to my head and pretended you weren't listening for the snap of the trigger." She didn't flinch. "I was protecting you," she said. "If I had stepped in too soon, they would have pulled you from the case. Nash would have shut it down. You think I liked watching that traffic stop play out? You think I didn't want to rip the doors off their cruiser and end it right there?" "You used me," Darius said. The words quieter now, but so much heavier. "Same as him." "No," she said. "Nash used you. I watched because I had to. But I never stopped fighting for you, even when you thought I was the threat." He looked away, the silence closing in like fog. Everything he had trusted, his agency, his mission, his own instincts, had been warped. But underneath the betrayal was something more potent: purpose. Now, there was no more illusion. No more chain of command. Just the truth. "You still reporting to them?" he asked. "No," she said. "I burned my signal. As far as they know, I'm still monitoring you. But I'm out. And you're sure you're not the only one?" "If I was," she said, "I wouldn't still be breathing." They stared at each other for a long moment. Not allies, not enemies. Something rawer than either. Survivors of a war they hadn't realized they were fighting on separate fronts until now. Darius turned back to the table and laid out the remaining documents. One of them was a supply ledger tied to a cartel warehouse near the southern state line. It included an outgoing manifest, 2 crates of high-grade currency counterfeits, 1 sat phone bundle, and a notation with 3 initials scrawled in red ink: KHJ, Kavanaugh, Heller, Johnson, their known logistics runner. They weren't gone yet. "They're trying to skip the country," Darius said, his tone low and focused now, already shifting from fury to strategy. "They're using a smuggler's cabin off Route 18. It's outfitted with cartel safe passage codes, forged visas, everything." "They think they're ghosts already," Lila added. "They don't know we've cracked the network node their runner used." Darius folded the folder closed, eyes narrowing. "Then we don't wait. We move before Nash does." Lila nodded. "We do this quiet. If Nash gets wind, he'll burn the rest of the files. Or worse, spin this whole thing back on us." Darius grabbed his field bag, clipped his weapon to his hip, and pulled on the nondescript jacket that had gotten him through more field raids than he could count. "No comms," he said. "No trackers, no digital trace. We go in, we get them, and we get out." Lila followed him to the door. "And when we bring them back?" He didn't slow. "Then we make them talk." Outside, the sun had dropped low, casting long shadows across the street like cracks in the world's surface. And for the first time since the red Aston Martin had been pulled over on a clean city street, Darius felt like he could finally see the road ahead. They left the city behind before midnight, driving with the lights off for the first 3 miles, then merging onto rural side roads where traffic cameras didn't reach, and patrol presence was scarce enough to feel like fiction. The sky above was a low ceiling of gray, moonless and silent, and the engine hummed soft beneath the rumble of worn tires. Darius drove without music, without voice, without distraction, his hands steady on the wheel, his mind running through every route, every code phrase, every cartel drop site that could connect to the path Kavanaugh and Heller were taking to slip through the cracks. Lila sat beside him, scanning burner phone geotraces bouncing off unregistered towers, ghost signals from prepaid devices that had no IME matches in any domestic registry. The cartel didn't just use throwaways. They cycled numbers through Eastern European nodes, bounced them back through cartel relays in Veracruz, and injected them into U.S. airwaves through agricultural signal spoofers. But Darius had written part of the initial playbook. He recognized the patterns, even the ones they'd tried to evolve beyond him. "They're not using blind hops anymore," she said, her fingers moving across the cracked tablet screen. "They're skimming manifest lines from abandoned FedEx yards. One phone pinged outside Amarillo 5 hours ago, bounced again in Wichita Falls. Same device ID, new burner SIM. They're leapfrogging trucks," Darius replied, eyes still locked on the road. "Riding shipments. That's cartel playbook, not law enforcement escape. They're still getting help from inside. Civilians don't know how to strip satellite tags from fleet manifests. Someone's ghosting them. Then we narrow the help," he said. "Find the trail they didn't erase fast enough." They stopped in Wichita Falls just before dawn, parking near a closed truck depot, and slipping through a bent section of chain-link fencing. It was quiet, industrial dead space littered with pallets and rusted trailers. Inside the depot office, the lights were off, but the emergency panel blinked with residual charge. A lone janitor, old, weary, and barely awake, was the only sign of life. Darius showed no badge, only a snapshot of the burner phone's ping data. "Did this truck come through here last night?" The man blinked behind scratched glasses. "Maybe. Lot of trucks come through here." Lila stepped forward, more direct. "You let someone backdoor your system?" He frowned, but his eyes darted, quick and guilty, toward the office behind him. That was all they needed. Inside the small back room, they found it. An old laptop left logged into a restricted shipping portal, and on the screen, a manifest log showing the exact coordinates Darius had guessed. Cabin. Remote. 2 exits. Cartel-registered delivery 3 days prior. No return manifest logged. Bingo. They were headed back to the vehicle when they heard it. The voice, raised, angry, on the far side of the depot yard. 2 officers in highway patrol uniforms, young, both white, stood beside an unmarked cruiser, one holding a clipboard, the other gesturing sharply toward a black teenager no older than 20, seated on the curb with his hands zip-tied and blood drying along the side of his face. He wasn't resisting. He wasn't crying. He just stared at the ground like it had betrayed him. "What's this?" Darius said, already walking forward. "Routine stop," one officer snapped. "Car matched a stolen VIN. No ID, no registration." "That your reason for putting hands on a kid?" Darius interrupted, already moving between them. He got mouthy. "He got pulled from a car that was his," Darius said. "That's what this looks like." "Step back, sir." "Badge number," Lila cut in, showing hers, cold and calm. The officers hesitated. Darius knelt beside the kid. "What's your name?" "Marcus," the boy said, his voice rough from adrenaline and swallowed pride. "Marcus Bell. Where's your registration?" "In the glove box." "You told them that?" He nodded. Darius stood. "Let him go." "Who are you?" the first officer asked. "Someone you don't want reading your complaint file." Minutes later, they had the cuffs off, the boy in the back of their vehicle, and the patrol officers retreating with the look of men who didn't understand how fast the ground had shifted beneath them. "He just bought it," Marcus said quietly, rubbing his wrists. "Worked 2 jobs, 3 years. Finally made the down payment. Then they roll up and act like I stole it out of their driveway." Lila looked at Darius, her voice low. "It's the same pattern, same triggers." Darius didn't answer right away. Instead, he handed Marcus a burner phone. "Go home. Call the number on the lock screen if anyone comes around asking questions." Marcus hesitated. "Why are you helping me?" "Because I've been where you are," Darius said. "And no one helped me then." They dropped him at a diner on the edge of town, paid the cashier to watch over him until his ride showed, and vanished before he could say anything else. Back in the car, Lila finally spoke. "You okay?" "No," Darius said. "But we're getting close." They reached the cabin an hour after sunrise. It was tucked in a hollow between 2 ridges, surrounded by a thicket of pines and backed by a dry creek bed. The air was still, the quiet unnatural. No movement, no smoke, no guard on the ridge. That wasn't safety. It was silence too neat, too controlled. "They're waiting," Lila murmured. Darius nodded. "Let's knock anyway." They moved through the brush, splitting wide, approaching from opposite flanks. Inside, behind those walls, were the last men who could tie Monahan to Nash's broader operation, who could name names, confirm the real structure, and give them the evidence to bury the agency's rot once and for all. This wouldn't be a clean arrest, but nothing about justice ever was. The woods swallowed sound the way deep water swallowed light, slowly, hungrily, without permission. Pine needles cushioned each footfall, thick layers of wet soil muffled every movement, and the trees stood close enough to block wind, moon, and sky, until it felt like stepping into the lungs of something ancient and breathless. Darius moved without haste, but not because he was careless. He moved like a predator who had hunted here before, whose rhythm matched the pace of the land. He approached the cabin from the southern ridge, crouching low beneath a thicket of cedar brush that stretched along the tree line like natural camouflage. He could see the corner of the roof now, wood rotted at the edges, the chimney dark, no smoke. To the untrained eye, it looked abandoned, forgotten in the folds of wilderness. But Darius could hear the electricity humming in the wall conduit. There was heat, there was power, and he could feel the tension rising like heat off asphalt, invisible but tangible, the way you could feel a storm right before it broke open the sky. His earpiece crackled once. Lila's voice, hushed but precise. No movement on thermal. Cabins still. They're not inside, Darius said, more to himself than to her. They're in the trees. There was a pause. Then, you sure? They know someone's coming. Too easy otherwise. He slipped the comms from his ear. No more noise. No more digital trace. Just instinct now. He moved wide, cutting a silent arc around the back of the property, his eyes adjusting to every shadow, every unnatural crease in the landscape. 15 yards from the cabin's back door, he spotted the first tripwire. Fishing line pulled tight between a bent nail and a buried spike, positioned ankle height, just deep enough under the leaves to snare someone who didn't know better. He stepped over it. Then he paused. A sound, too slow to be a bird, too shallow to be wind, rippled through the brush on his left. He turned, low and quick. The glint of metal caught the edge of his vision, and he ducked just as the blade sliced the air where his throat had been. Kavanaugh came from behind a tree, fast, armed with a combat knife, body crouched in a low stance built for ambush. He didn't waste time. He didn't speak. He lunged again, slashing in a tight arc meant to disable, not kill. Darius caught his wrist mid-swing, twisted hard, and drove his knee into Kavanaugh's ribs. The grunt that followed was enough to tell him the hit landed. But Kavanaugh wasn't green. He dropped his weight, rolled, and pulled Darius forward with him, using momentum to slam him into a tree trunk. Bark bit into the side of Darius's face as he twisted out of the grip, staggering backward, already adjusting. He drew his sidearm, but a second figure crashed into him from the left. Heller, thinner, faster, a collapsible baton snapping to full length as he struck low. The blow caught Darius across the thigh, sharp enough to numb the muscle. He fell to one knee. Heller grinned and raised the baton again. "Got you now, don't we, Agent?" But Darius didn't hesitate. He swept his leg across the dirt, caught Heller at the ankle, and sent him crashing to the ground. Then he rolled sideways, came up hard, and drove the butt of his pistol across Heller's temple with a dull, satisfying crack that split skin. Kavanaugh was already back on his feet, rushing him. They collided hard. Darius took the hit, but didn't fall. He pivoted, letting Kavanaugh's weight pass him, then brought an elbow down on the man's spine, twice, fast, brutal, unrelenting. Kavanaugh dropped to his knees, coughing, spitting blood. But even wounded, even staggering, he laughed. "You're too late," he said, breath hitching through broken ribs. "You think Nash isn't watching this? Think he didn't plan for it?" Darius stepped back, breathing hard, sweat already trailing down his spine. "Maybe he did," he said, voice low, flat. "But he's not here." He turned, just in time for Heller to catch him with a blow to the jaw. Wild, sloppier than the last, but strong enough to send him reeling into the underbrush. Darius hit the dirt, rolled, and came up fighting. Blood filled his mouth. He spit it out and grinned. "Let's finish this." The ground gave slightly beneath Darius's boots as he charged, breath ragged, body coiled like a spring released mid-air. Heller came first, baton raised, shouting something that dissolved into air the moment Darius slammed into him, shoulder first. They hit the forest floor hard, a tangle of limbs and fury, but Darius had already adjusted, mounting fast, pinning the officer with a knee to the sternum as he drove two clean punches, into Heller's face, one to disorient, the next to punish. Bone cracked under his knuckles. Teeth snapped against each other. "You think this is justice?" Heller coughed, blood in his throat. "You're just another angry—" Darius cut him off with a forearm across the jaw, not to silence him, but to remind him that talk had always been cheap. This wasn't a courtroom. It wasn't a press conference. This was the reckoning that men like Heller never believed would come. He stood, just as Kavanaugh came barreling in from behind, still limping, still wheezing from the earlier strikes, but swinging a length of jagged rebar like he meant to take off Darius's head. The swing came low and fast. Darius ducked, spun, caught Kavanaugh's arm mid-swing, and twisted until the rebar dropped. Then he slammed his elbow into the side of Kavanaugh's neck. Once, twice, disrupting his balance, breaking his structure, and then lifting him off the ground just long enough to drive him flat against a nearby tree with a slam that rattled bark. "Try again," Darius growled. Kavanaugh roared, clawing forward, fists flying wild now. Desperate. Darius absorbed 2 hits to the ribs, grimacing as the breath went short in his lungs, but he didn't retreat. Instead, he stepped in close, body to body, and landed a devastating knee to the inside of Kavanaugh's thigh, a strike meant for nerve, not show, and then drove his fist into the side of the man's head so hard that Kavanaugh staggered sideways into the underbrush, crashing into a log and not rising for a full 5 seconds. "You know what your mistake was?" Darius asked, wiping blood from his mouth as he stepped forward, eyes locked on the man who'd mocked him, humiliated him, and stood grinning beside a stolen car like it had all been a game. Kavanaugh coughed, eyes unfocused. "Not killing you when we had the chance?" Darius shook his head slowly. "No. Thinking a badge made you untouchable." He didn't give Kavanaugh time to respond. He grabbed him by the collar, turned him over, and slammed his wrists into the mud with one arm, while drawing the cuffs from his belt with the other. The steel snapped shut with a finality that echoed louder than any gunshot. He stood, chest heaving, sweat and blood painting dark lines down his shirt, and turned to where Heller had begun crawling away through the brush. Slow, dazed, still trying to vanish into the trees like a coward who'd mistaken retreat for strategy. Darius caught him with a boot to the ribs, rolled him over, and pinned him to the ground with a knee between his shoulder blades. He didn't speak at first. Let the moment breathe. Let Heller feel it. That final second before fate closes the door. Then came the cuffs. Cold, tight, clean. Silence stretched across the forest clearing like a held breath. Darius stepped back, watching them both squirm on the forest floor. No longer armed, no longer powerful. Just 2 men who'd bet everything on the assumption that someone like him would never get this far. He let the silence hang just long enough to become uncomfortable. Then, calm as stone, he said, "You took my car." He crouched, close enough for them both to hear the low timbre of his voice, no longer burning with rage, but burning with something colder. Resolution. "I took your whole empire." Neither of them spoke. What could they say? Everything was gone now. The impound ring, the shell corporations, the off-the-books warehouse deals, the precinct protection, the homeland firewall. The walls had cracked. The floor had collapsed, and the man they'd profiled, mocked, and used as bait was the one putting them in chains. Lila stepped into the clearing behind them, rifle lowered but eyes sharp. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. She'd heard the line. She'd seen the fall. "You good?" she asked, her voice even. Darius didn't answer right away. He looked down at his hands, blood-stained, cut, bruised, and then at the 2 men lying bound at his feet. "Not yet," he said. but his voice was clearer now, grounded. "Let's bring them in." They left the woods slow, dragging their prisoners behind them through the thinning fog of early morning. The sky had begun to lighten, and somewhere in the distance a hawk circled overhead, silent against the blue. And as the trees parted, revealing the car waiting on the gravel road just beyond the ridge, Darius exhaled for the first time in what felt like weeks. The road forward was brutal, but it was his. They didn't speak much on the drive back. The prisoners, cuffed, bruised, and bound in the back seat, were groaning but otherwise quiet. Their bravado had dried up somewhere between the blood on their lips and the realization that Darius wasn't just another field agent chasing orders. He was the end of the road. And this wasn't just an arrest. It was an indictment of everything they'd built. By the time they reached the safe drop site outside city limits, Lila was already decrypting the final data sets they'd pulled from the cartel logs and Homeland's scrubbed archive mirror, the ones she'd been saving for a moment like this, when the air was thin and irreversible decisions had to be made in silence. Darius watched the sunrise over the concrete skyline with the distant calm of a man who knew something was ending, not just for him, but for an entire order of power. "They'll come for us," Lila said, without looking up from the screen. "Let them," he said. "We've already burned the escape plan." She nodded and inserted the final drive into the signal boost relay. One tap. That was all it took. The data packet, codename Veritas, activated with a pulse. It bypassed Homeland's firewall entirely, skipped the legal review backlog, and delivered the full payload directly to 3 destinations: the Office of the Inspector General, the Senate Oversight Subcommittee, and every major press outlet, with a secure whistleblower channel. It included time-stamped files, secure call recordings, satellite records, and the ghost logs from Nash's classified clearance activity, the ones that had authorized the auction laundering, the off-book seizures, and the assignment of operatives like Monahan under black label immunity. Darius had narrated the final piece himself, a direct statement to the public, unfiltered. "My name is Darius Avery. I've served Homeland Security for 12 years. I believed in what I was trained to protect. I believed in the system. But that system is broken. And it's not broken by accident. It's been broken by design. No embellishment, no melodrama, just the truth." Within 30 minutes of the leak, the ripple became a wave. Local news picked it up first. An investigative podcast out of Atlanta broke the opening line with urgency. By the time the national networks caught up, footage of the red Aston Martin being pulled onto a tow truck was already playing on loop, paired with audio from Darius's traffic stop and footage of his agents raiding a cartel-linked impound lot outside Houston. The response from Homeland was immediate. They issued a statement condemning the unauthorized release of classified information and placed Darius under formal suspension. The order came with a shadow clause: no access to facilities, field status revoked, comms terminated. But they were too late, because by the time the internal servers began locking him out, Lila had already deployed the secondary measure. A digital kill switch protocol embedded inside a dormant surveillance report, one programmed to deliver a complete cache of Nash's personal emails, burner phone activity, and encrypted chat records to the Inspector General's internal audit team. Everything Nash had touched, signed, rerouted, or buried now lived in mirrored archives on secure OIG servers and off-site storage nodes across 4 states. It was the administrative equivalent of setting a building on fire and locking the exits from the outside. Darius didn't return home. He went dark, rented a room under a false ID, blacked out the windows, turned off his phone. He didn't watch the broadcasts. He didn't read the headlines. He didn't need to. The point had never been fame or spectacle. It had always been the slow, hard truth, dragging rot into daylight. making sure it couldn't crawl back into the walls. Lila met him 2 days later, in a safe house above an abandoned auto shop, her hair pulled back, her eyes red from lack of sleep, but burning with clarity. "They're going after Nash," she said. He looked up, not surprised but still burning behind the eyes, as if confirmation still had the power to cut. "Criminal or internal?" "Both," Lila replied, her voice low but steady, anchored by the weight of all they'd carried. Senate's called an emergency oversight session. IG froze his assets. His burner went dark 8 hours ago. And his response? She shook her head once, not in confusion but in quiet disgust. Nothing. Not yet. Darius leaned back, the chair creaking beneath him as he stared at the cracked ceiling above. The faded water stains shaped like broken maps, veins of damage branching out from an old wound in the plaster, like the system itself. He exhaled slowly, not in relief, not in surrender, but in that long, final breath a man takes when the war he's been walking through finally starts to end on his terms. Then he's waiting to see if this dies in the next cycle. Lila didn't answer immediately. She just sat across from him, watching the man she'd followed through gunfire and betrayal and silence, knowing the silence might have been the most dangerous part of all. Between them, the weight of everything they'd done, everything they'd exposed, hung like fog, dense and honest and unmovable. "You did it," she said at last, the words not meant as flattery or comfort, but as fact. He didn't smile. He didn't shift. He didn't let pride steal the meaning. "No," he said. "We started it." And she understood. Because it wasn't just Nash. It never had been. The man was a symptom, not the disease. One of many who had learned how to feed on the system without ever leaving fingerprints. But the breach they'd torn through the wall? That crack was wide enough now for others to see through, to follow, to use as proof that what hid behind authority could be dragged into daylight and forced to bleed. When Monahan was taken down, it was clean and quiet, and early enough in the morning that the neighborhood barely noticed until the sirens were already gone. No statement was read, no press release issued. But the charges were federal and devastating. Racketeering, conspiracy, abuse of office, falsification of warrants, obstruction of justice. He hadn't even fought it. By the time they opened the encrypted folders on his laptop and matched the auction chains to shell companies in 5 states, he stopped talking altogether. The list of accomplices reached into precincts that had once been called clean. Dozens of officers were suspended. Investigations opened simultaneously in Chicago, Detroit, Dallas, and Tampa. In some departments, captains turned on each other to reduce charges. In others, old case files mysteriously disappeared overnight, only to reappear again in the hands of the press. Internal Affairs divisions scrambled to control the narrative, but the evidence was too detailed, too specific, too interconnected to ignore. The pattern was undeniable. Targeted vehicle seizures, nearly all involving Black or Latino men, often pulled from traffic stops with no legal basis. The cars disappeared into city impounds that no one admitted existed. VINs were swapped, paperwork falsified. Then the vehicles were sold to holding companies with no employees and offices that didn't exist, and from there flipped to cartel buyers or washed through the auction houses Homeland had once used as covert drop zones. And Darius had tracked every thread. Kavanaugh and Heller, once too smug to look over their shoulders, were tried separately, but sentenced together. Their defense collapsed under the weight of body cam footage, subpoenaed comms, and sworn statements from agents and citizens they had once brutalized with impunity. The footage of Darius's traffic stop, the one they thought would never see the light, was played during closing arguments in both trials. Neither man made eye contact with the screen. One cried when the verdict was read. The other simply stared at the floor and didn't move, even when the guards came to take him. They were both sentenced to 30 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole. No badge, no shield, no special treatment, just a number and a cage. Across the country, badge numbers once held in quiet reverence were stripped from lockers in silence. Promotions were rescinded. Medals were returned. And for the first time in years, the blue wall cracked not from protest, but from proof. As for Nash, he ran, or tried to. But the travel hold had been filed 2 hours before he reached the airport, and when the plane stopped for refueling in Bermuda, federal marshals boarded it with quiet precision. There was no fight. Just a man in a tailored suit who didn't look like a criminal until you saw what he'd signed, what he'd hidden, and how many lives he'd cost with his ambition. He was extradited within 12 hours, stripped of clearance, stripped of his pension, stripped of the title he'd once worn like armor. He now faces trial on a federal racketeering indictment. And unlike those before him, the cameras won't turn away. Darius testified before Congress under protective detail. He wore a gray suit, pressed and plain, and spoke with calm fire, detailing what it meant to be used not just as bait, but as a symbol, what it meant to be told justice existed while watching it sold, file by file, behind locked conference doors. And as he walked out that chamber, no longer just a witness, no longer just a survivor, he carried none of the fear they'd once tried to beat into him. Only purpose. Because now they knew his name, and they would never forget what he'd done with it. The impound lot looked almost unchanged, still surrounded by the same rusted fencing, still guarded by a gate that creaked when it opened, still smelling faintly of oil, dust, and disuse, as though time had stood still while the rest of the city tried to forget what had been buried here. But it hadn't. Not really. Because some places don't hold time. They hold memory. And the memory here wasn't of cars or paperwork. It was of theft, sanctioned by silence. Darius stepped out of the unmarked vehicle and stood for a moment beneath the pale afternoon sky, watching as 2 Homeland technicians unlatched the final chain securing the lot's private wing. Beyond it, gleaming under the gentle slant of sun and steel, was the red Aston Martin. Clean, detailed, repainted in the exact crimson tone it had worn the morning everything started to unravel. It didn't shine like it had before, not exactly, but that wasn't a failure. It was something else, something better. As if the car had grown a history of its own, and returned not as property reclaimed, but as a survivor with its own pulse and scars. He didn't speak as the techs handed over the keys. He just nodded once, accepting the gesture with a gravity that needed no words. Leela stood to his left, arms folded, watching the scene unfold with the same careful detachment she always wore when things meant more than they seemed. She didn't say anything either. Not yet. She just followed him as he approached the driver's side and ran his hand slowly across the hood, fingers tracing the curve like he was reading the surface for some invisible inscription. It wasn't just a car anymore, not a trophy, not a symbol of status, not even a sting operation's bait. It was what was left after power had tried to break him and failed. He opened the door, slid into the seat, and let the silence fill the cabin before turning the key. The engine purred alive, low and smooth, like an old friend breathing for the first time in months. They cleaned it top to bottom, Lila said finally, glancing over at the dash. Probably replaced every wire you touched. Still ours, he said. Still means something. He backed it slowly out of the lot, pausing just before the gates, letting his eyes wander one last time across the yard. No cartel buyers, no fake auctions, no falsified tow slips, just pavement and closure. Then he drove. He took the long way through the city. Not because he had somewhere to be, but because he wanted to remember how it felt. The neighborhoods looked the same. Cracked sidewalks, corner stores, barbershops with hand-painted signs, mothers pushing strollers past hydrants speckled with chalk. But now, the glances he caught weren't suspicious or guarded. They were curious, warm, even proud. Some people recognized the car. A few even recognized him. One boy raised a fist and nodded. Darius returned it with a slight smile and rolled the window down farther. When he reached the block where it had all started, that unassuming stretch of road where the red lights glared, and two officers thought a black man couldn't own something clean without owing for it, he slowed to a stop. Not to dwell, not to rage, just to look. The street was quiet now, peaceful. No sirens, no shouts. Just the sound of wind moving through the leaves above, and the rumble of the Aston's engine. Waiting. He didn't park this time. He kept driving. By evening, he was back at headquarters. They had offered him a corner office on the third floor, freshly painted and outfitted with polished wood and a view of the Capitol skyline. He had declined it immediately. Too much glass, too much ceremony, not enough ground to stand on. Instead, he took an operational post and built something new. It started with 5 agents, then 10, all vetted by external review. No fast-tracked favors, no political assignments, no one who couldn't pass a background check under full light. They came from every background: rural precincts, inner-city narcotics, cybercrime, civil rights law. They didn't wear the same badge, but they carried the same compass. Lila stood at his side the day they launched. "No mission statement?" she asked, watching the analysts pin targets across a projected map of newly flagged precincts and illicit auction sites. "We don't chase crime," he said, his voice low but firm. "We chase the rot, from the inside out." That became the creed, not printed on walls, not recited in speeches, just understood, lived. By the time Nash was indicted in federal court, and news outlets began calling Darius the whistleblower with teeth, he had already moved on from the attention. He declined every interview. He stopped checking the headlines. Because the mission had never been to be seen, it had always been to see clearly, even when others refused to. And months later, on a quiet morning before dawn, he parked the red Aston Martin at the edge of a familiar overlook, same place he'd driven to years ago after completing his first federal contract, the one he had celebrated with the car, the suit, and the clean silence of pride before someone decided it all meant too much for a man like him to own it without question. He stepped out slowly, letting the wind carry the cold against his skin. The city stretched out beneath him, lights blinking slow across the sprawl like the last heartbeat of night, before the sun pulled it all forward. He didn't smile big, just enough. Not because he had won, but because, for once, justice didn't blink. And that was enough. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.